Hey, everybody. It's your host, David. I don't know if you guys can hear me or see me, but if there's anybody in the chat, let me just pop something into the comments just to let me know if this is working. I have a bit of a different new setup, so hoping that this is all working. Or maybe my lips are just moving and no one can hear a damn thing I'm saying. So that's always a distinct possibility. Okay, there we go. It's always nice to have the confirmation from people out there that yes, you can indeed hear me. So, and loud and clear. Is there any kind of echo or anything like that on this at the moment that anybody can pick up, or is it really just sort of fairly even, fairly muted? Like it's not a great setup at the moment, but sounds good. Okay, perfect. Good. That's always good to know. And the reason I'm asking that is I have a home office space properly now, 3.5 years after a pandemic. I am finally in my own working space, like not sitting at my dining room table, not competing with other people, et cetera, et cetera. So I spent the last couple of weeks sort of putting a workspace together and that kind of stuff. Hence the blank wall at the back that still needs to be filled with something. So hopefully by the next time that I do a live stream, there will actually be some things on that wall. Okay, look, house is filling up. I apologize. There was no notice about this. I found myself with a little bit of extra time this morning and figured, you know what, I haven't done one of these in a little while. It's probably going to be at least a few more weeks before I can clear a good headspace to be able to do a live stream. So I figured I would jump in here. And for those of you who are here, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it. So thank you very much for being here. Hopefully now that I actually have a space in the house that I can do this in a more regularly, and B, I can actually do this at sort of some different times of the day as well. So that I'm not exclusively catering to people who are home during the day in North America, or possibly like late mid-afternoon-ish kind of thing in Europe, or wherever you might happen to be. I've had a couple of people in Asia Pacific that have sent me comments basically saying that I'm excluding them. They're not being malicious or mean or anything, but it is certainly not intentional. But I'm hoping that I can start to vary things up a little bit now that I have a workspace that I can work in. So cool. So I didn't prepare anything for this. As I said, like this really was just sort of a impromptu last minute kind of thing. I figured I would jump in and see who was around and if anybody had questions or conversation topics that they want to talk about. Not Cold War related in the slightest, but I just saw that Jerry Springer just passed away. He was 79 years old. You want to talk about a guy who is influential in terms of media and how television works. That guy... I shouldn't say that. Like I was going to say, he's not a nice guy. I actually have no idea what he was like as a person. I've heard mixed things. A lot of people don't know that he was actually the mayor of Cincinnati for a chunk of time before he turned to paternity tests. But he died. So. Luke, no dogs. I am my working space now is upstairs, not in the dining room, and the dogs don't like coming upstairs because that's where the bath is. They associate coming up the stairs with only ever getting a bath, so they never come upstairs. So unfortunately, no, the dogs will not be joining the live streams anymore. So I wish they would come up and join just because I like having them around, but that's not happening. So. Yes, Jerry Springer just passed away. Like I got that notification like 20 minutes ago. So that is breaking news from the Cold War that somebody not related to the Cold War at all just passed away. So, okay, there's actually a lot of questions coming through and I haven't had a chance to really look at all of them because I'm just prattling on here. That's Joe Cool. How has my cognition of Cold War history shaped my view of Russia's war in Ukraine? That's a really interesting question. And there's a couple of different ways, just off the top of my head, there's a couple of different ways that I could sort of address that. If you'd have asked me that question, and I asked a lot of people that question 30 years ago, like what was my view of Soviet history and how that's going to affect Ukrainian-Russian relations, the answer then would be very different from what it is now. I think the last 30 years have actually been have done a lot to show, and people have done a lot of work investigating and exploring the idea that this, I'm going to use the word post-Soviet space, and I'm hearing there's pushback against that now even, but I think it's a firm descriptor. That post-Soviet space, those relationships, not even just to, like, say, the satellite countries, but even within the Soviet republics, were a lot more fraught with tension and rivalry than a lot of people imagined, certainly during the Cold War. It is not unusual to be reading Cold War era documents, like primary source documents, military reviews, things like that, where Soviet Union and Russia are interchangeable, which just, I mean, we know now and we recognize now that that really is not the case at all. The Soviet Union was a collection of independent republics. Independent republics, I mean, that's when we say independent, like, you know, it's like autonomous, independent, like, yeah, there's all these different layers. Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot more attention and a much deeper history that runs there than certainly that's understood now than it was 30 years ago. I don't really necessarily want to get into a whole lot about talking about like the sort of the war in Ukraine right now. That's a whole other thing. That really is a whole other thing. Kings and Generals obviously is doing some really excellent ongoing work on updating all of those. For those of you who may not have seen any of that work, I highly encourage to go check it out. They're doing an excellent job. Jarko 5000 is another question. And, you know, this is actually, I'm seeing this question a fair bit. This seems to come up relatively often. Do we think we're heading for a new Cold War? I talked about this on the last live stream, and I think it's worth addressing again because there may be some different people that are in here. Hopefully there's some different people and other people are coming to hear me talk at you guys. I think the preconditions for a new Cold War are being created. Are we in a Cold War right now? No, I don't think so. I don't think there's an ideological rivalry. There's a power rivalry that's happening. Absolutely. And to be totally fair, Russia isn't the major player in that. It is absolutely, like, that's what's being created is between China and the United States. But that's not an ideological rivalry. That's very much just pure power politics. The other aspect that's very different from the Cold War is that those two economies there is decoupling that's happening, but those two economies are incredibly interlinked to each other. As I said, while there is decoupling, there is some separation that's happening. They are very much, they work together. One exists in, you know, because of the other, back and forth. That's not what the case was during that, and that isn't the case during a Cold War. During a Cold War, there's two separate spheres, and their interactions are limited, and it's very much a head-to-head rivalry, and they're theoretically they're autarkic within their own spheres. We don't see that with this Sino-American rivalry that seems to be heating up and that seems to be ongoing right now. Does that mean that we're entering a Cold War? Take this in the spirit that it's intended. I hope that if something's going to happen, that it is a Cold War and not and not a hot war. That was probably going to be a much more powerful and impactful statement had I not just flubbed that and, you know, choked. But yeah, I mean, that's very much, that's my opinion in terms of, I would rather see a Cold War develop rather than a hot war, because a hot war between two superpower rivals like that is messy, is a distinct understatement. But in terms of understanding Cold War, always think about that in terms of what their interdependencies on each other are like, and in terms of what's the guiding principle that underlies those differences. Is it just pure power politics? Is there an ideological aspect to it? Is it economic? Like, whatever that happens to be. I think we're far closer to. I think the last analogy that I made was that this is much closer to what existed in 1914 rather than 1945. But again, that's my own personal amateurish sort of like view and opinion of that. So, yeah, that's let's see. There are lots of questions coming through, and they keep scrolling up, and I apologize that I'm not answering every question. There's so many questions here. I could be here for a long, long time answering if I wanted to, and could address every single question. I'm on a bit of a time limit because I do have to work this afternoon. So, and I've got some things that I have to do, like go look after my dogs. So that's, yeah. Let's see. Ibner Smile, looking to see if we can make a video about Thailand during the Second World War and during the Cold War era. We wouldn't be touching Thailand we're focusing anyways specifically on Thailand during the Second World War. There's other channels that look after that and look after that very, very well. We don't consider that to be within our remit in terms of what we want to look at as a channel. Certainly Thailand during the Cold War does actually play there's an interesting role that happens there. And it ties in with like the role of the monarchy, certainly the bases and whatnot that the U.S. support and bases during the American War in Vietnam. And Thailand, it does play this really interesting role as this anchor and like this Western anchor in Southeast Asia. It's certainly no democracy, but we think we've all sort of seen, certainly from the last few months, weeks worth of videos that we've done. It's pretty apparent that a proper functioning democracy was certainly not a precondition of being a Western ally. As long as you were anti-communist, you were in the group. And Thailand certainly fits into that bill. I'm not going to say the sham of democracy, but if democracy ever got out of control and military stepping in, and it's like your classic deep state, like you see. I hate using that word because it flags a whole bunch of conspiracy guys, but the idea of like a deep state, what you see in Thailand, what you see in Turkey and several other countries around the world, that's very much a thing. And Thailand is a really great example of that. So, we probably will be delving into that a little bit. So, it's a good suggestion. Won't be Second World War focused, but it'll certainly be Cold War focused. So, memory meme. Will there be a series created about the Vietnam War similar to Kings and Generals? Their series on the Pacific. To be honest, no, we're not planning on doing a series like that for Vietnam. We will do. Vietnam will be covered. We're going to do it like that's a multi-part series, and I've got a couple of ideas in terms of how we want to address that. And some of it's going to be looking at political and economic. Some of it's looking at combat operations. Vietnam is. Like there's domestic stuff. There's like in the U.S. there's domestic stuff within Vietnam. How North Vietnam like address all this. Vietnam is this huge beast to unpack. But in terms of doing it as a series like Kings and Generals is addressing with the Pacific War, no, we don't want to approach it that way. I sort of have in mind maybe a 10-part series sort of thing, and that might get more, might get less. I'm not exactly sure. There is a ton of stuff to unpack and uncover there. I was just listening to an interview with an author talking about Agent Orange and dioxin poisoning that happened, and how there's been so much more work in uncovering sort of the truth about how Agent Orange was used, intents, what did happen, what didn't happen with it. And then what's happening with the effects of it now, 50 years later. And that could be its own episode. Do I want to do a whole episode on that? Yes, I would love to, but is the channel going to get enough views to be able to make that, are people going to tune into a 50-part series on Vietnam? Hopefully there's 90 of you sitting here right now that said, yes, absolutely. But I need a few more zeros at the end of that. Whereas I know if we shorten it down and sort of do a little bit more compact and then make some recommendations for people to go and like explore some other things, like reading material, viewing material, etc., that might be a better way to approach that. So I'm also getting old. And, it's like I can't do this forever. I'm not that old, but I feel old. I can't do this forever. If we were to do Vietnam, I mean, to be honest, we're doing the Cold War. We could do Vietnam the exact same way and be here in 10 years still producing videos. There is so much content that can be done on Vietnam. And if somebody out there wants to do that, let me know. And I would love to know if someone's would love to be able to get into that, because that's a fantastic, super interesting project to be able to do. Were there more blood telegrams that were never declassified during the Cold War? Farasama, I'm assuming, if you'd asked a question earlier and I missed it and I apologize, assuming you're speaking about the blood telegram regarding Bangladesh or East Pakistan in 1971. For those who don't know, well, anyways, without getting into that, we're going to do an episode on the blood telegram because it's super interesting. It's super interesting piece of South Asian history. Were there more blood telegrams that were never declassified during the Cold War? Probably. Do I know about them? Not if they've never been declassified. I don't have any kind of special access or secret information that you guys don't. So, what is a blood telegram? The blood telegram was, so when Nixon went to China, I mean, Nixon is famous for going to China in 1970. Kissinger went in 71, Nixon went 72. I can't remember the dates, but how did that work? Pakistan, who had decent relations with China at the time, the U.S. was looking to get into, basically the U.S. was looking to involve I don't want to say normalize because that necessarily wasn't the intent at the time, but the U.S. was wanting to form closer relations with mainland China under Nixon's presidency. And they were looking to do that as a way of leveraging China against the Soviet Union. This is all back to Cold War politics. Pakistan had good diplomatic communications back and forth with China. So what the US was doing is they were using Pakistan as an intermediary to communicate with Beijing. When West Pakistan decides to invade and put down a uprising, rebellion, there's a whole lot of weird words that you can use in East Pakistan because they were looking for independence. There was what some scholars and historians have deemed as a genocide was actually was being committed from West Pakistan on East Pakistan. And the U.S. had the ability to step in to tell Pakistan, who it also had good relations with, to stop the killing. But Nixon and Kissinger didn't want to do that for fear that it would jeopardize Pakistan's role in trying to leverage an opening with China. And it's something that's called the blood telegram, was a communication that basically said, it's like, no, you can't, the US can't, it's like intervene in this domestic internal Pakistan affair. What ended up happening was the Indians actually intervened, put down the West Pakistan, I've got to always think about this, the West Pakistani armies, genocide, mass killing of East Pakistan, and what emerged from that in 1971 was the state of Bangladesh. That's the blood telegram. It's amazingly, more people don't actually know about this. It's known, it's out there. It's not like it's a secret. It's common knowledge, but once you get outside of certain academics, I don't want to say academic circles, but once you get into the sort of the broader memory, that whole event just isn't well known at all, surprisingly. Or not surprisingly. Up until a few years ago, I wasn't particularly familiar with it. I've always considered myself to be relatively aware of sort of the general process of events. That a lot of that was new to me. I didn't know that, so I'm a little bit more familiar with it now. And hopefully once we actually get an episode together on this, which we will do, then I will know a whole lot more, and hopefully so will you guys. Yeah. David Hasselhoff ended the Cold War by standing on the wall and throwing pot noodles to the East Germans. Yes, I've absolutely heard that theory that David Hasselhoff, Germans love him, ended the Cold War. Sure, you know what? He played a role. I mean, I don't think there's any denying that. Whether it was because he stood on the wall and threw pot noodles, probably not. But you know, that he was a part of that, sort of those final steps, those final hammer blows that really brought everything down. Yeah. Are there any major conflicts that occurred in the Cold War besides Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan that is not as often talked about? Yeah, there's a ton. In terms of major conflicts, yeah, and what I was just like talking about with South Asia, like the fighting, like the formation of Bangladesh is an incredibly messy and very bloody event that happened. Do people deem it a major event? I think Western arrogance might be the wrong word, but sort of like this, from this Western centric perspective that people in the West, you know, are prone to, they don't consider it a major event. There were like hundreds of thousands of, like millions. I actually I'm unclear at the moment in terms of what that number was. It was massive bloodletting. There have been several wars between India and Pakistan. Major conflicts that occurred: the Iran-Iraq War from 81 to 89, 80, basically through the 80s, the decades. Don't quote me on those dates. That was hundreds of thousands of dead. That is a major war. The challenge that a lot of people get presented with in term is a lot of comes down to, what do you define as a war? The Cold War was very much marked by a lot of what we deem to be insurgency and counterinsurgency wars. The big set piece, you know, battle lines being drawn and two formal forces on either side. That's pretty rare. And that's pretty rare in general. Very much the 20th century and the Cold War period is full of conflict. It's full of fighting. It's full of wars. But they're bush wars. They're guerrilla wars. That doesn't make them not major conflicts. It just makes them not the Gulf War. It just makes them not the Second World War. Even we hear about Vietnam, we hear about Korea. We don't actually hear as much about Korea as we should. We hear about Vietnam. We hear about Afghanistan because they involved the United States. They involved the Soviet Union, and they played these public memory pivotal roles. But there's lots of other wars, like the South African Bush War is one that went on for like a decade. And I think outside of Southern Africa, it's very rarely talked about. The Iran-Iraq War is a really huge example of, and that's actually a more formal conflict. Like that was trench warfare, but literally trench warfare with gas. Like it was World War I with tanks and mass wave attacks. And it was horrible, absolutely horrible. Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of conflict. Everything that was happening in the guerrilla warfare that was happening in like Central America, in parts of South America, same type of thing. Rebellion, like small scale rebellion, that's still major conflict because it's incredibly disruptive. It's incredibly, like, the bloodletting is immense. It's difficult, I think, unless you're any conflict is major if you're a part of it. If that makes any kind of sense? Hopefully that does for most people. The farther away, the farther you are removed from it, the less major it might seem. It's when it starts impacting your own life. So for hundreds of millions of, there's billions of people that were affected by conflict throughout the entire, Cold War period to the through the 20th century, but certainly even just during the Cold War period, those were all major wars for those who were involved. And I always I'm trying to overcome my own priorly formed biases and prejudices, and that's how I want to think about these things. Is that, it's 100 people were killed. Well, okay, if you're comparing that to like a Civil War battle, like an American Civil War battle, 100 people, it's a drop in the bucket. But that's 100 people with families. That's 100 people, it's like they were, kids, wives, husbands, children, whatever. Like that's all of those things. It becomes much more major when you're a part of it. So, yeah, von Peterhoff. I think that's actually a really great comment. A South African teacher that you had used to say that his brother fought in Angola, where the Cold War was rather hot. The Cold War was incredibly hot in a lot of different places. It just wasn't thermonuclear hot, and we should all be glad and fortunate that never happened. But yeah, the Cold War wasn't as cold as people want, as old history books would have you believe. The Cold War was very much a bloody and deadly conflict. It just didn't happen to have involved nuclear weapons, and it didn't involve as many, Westerners as something like the Second World War did. So that's choosing my words slightly carefully there. Did the Allies start the Cold War by invading in 1919? This is a question that comes back to when did this really just comes down to when did the Cold War start? And there's a very good case to be made. It's a really interesting and compelling case, I think, that the Cold War actually started in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. I'm not sure that I 100% buy into that, because if only one side knows that they're at war, is it really a war? This is a philosophy question. I have no idea. But that's very much this idea that, it's like that the Allied intervention into the Russian Civil War in 1919 very much set up the suspicion and the conflict within what became the Soviet Union of the intentions of the West, and everything just sort of snowballed. But was the West aware that the Soviet Union was at war with them? Not for a good chunk of that, to be perfectly blunt. I think there was always a minority group that were very anti-communist, that were very anti-Soviet Union, but there was a fairly substantial group of people, influential people across the West, that were interested in normalizing relations and having a normal dialogue with the Soviet Union as this new country. Yeah, that's so. Do I think the Allies started the Cold War? What started the Cold War? That's such a. I don't know that there's this. That's such a black and white question that wants a black and white answer, and I personally don't think it's as easy as that. So, why does that's actually Yemen? Someone's just asking me about Yemen. Why did the division of Yemen get so little attention compared to Korea, Germany, and Vietnam? I actually don't know as much about Yemen as I would really, really like to. And I keep especially with what's happening in Yemen now, this is coming more and more front of mind for me that we need to delve into what the history of Yemen through the Cold War. As to why it gets little attention, there's just not as much there. Timing has a lot to do with that as well. British influence, the British influence to step in and handle it themselves rather than letting anyone else get involved. Egypt plays a role in that. And of course, Egypt is certainly anti-Western under Nasser. There's all these different influences that happen, but I definitely want to come back to Yemen, because I think that's a great question. It's a great topic that not a lot of people are necessarily talking about. So, is U Thant, who's the former UN General Secretary, famous during the Cold War or overrated by the Myanmar people, by the Burmese? U Thant was absolutely a leading light at the United Nations back when the United Nations was relevant and important. He was, I don't know how old everybody out there is, but certainly when I was a kid and when I was a teenager, everyone knew who the UN Secretary General was. Everyone, it's like I'm not going to say the fear of the United Nations, but the idea that you were going to be chastised or castigated by the United Nations, that was a genuine fear. It was an organization that had teeth, and it's been completely and totally made irrelevant since. I'm gonna hazard a guess here, and there'll be lots of argument and discussion that can happen about this, but I'm gonna guess that probably happened either by the late 90s and with the American bombing campaigns in Kosovo, or certainly by the start of the global war on terror. The UN really ceased to be any kind of relevant body. Certainly, as the Security Council or the General Assembly, there's constituent bodies of the UN that continue to be important and continue to have relevance, like UNESCO and things like that. But is U Thant, U Thant was absolutely a household name at the time, 100%. This is a great question from Togs. What happens when I run out of topics? Bye, guys. We end when we run out of topics. That's a really long time from now, though. We've been on the air. That actually shows my age too. We've been streaming these things since March 2019. We're over 4 years, and we're into a time period that is probably about the early 1960s. And there's still topics from the 40s that I would love to be able to go back and do, but we might do those as filler episodes later, kind of thing. There's no shortage of topics. There's no shortage of topics. When and if we ever do, then we'll air a final episode and say thank you very much, guys, and hopefully by that time I'll have something else to go. Maybe I'll actually grow up and go get a real job. So that's always a possibility. Do I have a specific favorite year to study? I don't. But to be perfectly honest, I don't have a favorite year to study. I think every year of the Cold War, every month of the Cold War has all kinds of different things happening, and nothing's ever confined to one specific year. There's always things it's like, okay, so 1989 is a great year because so much happened in 1989. We all know that's the wall coming down. That's the start of the opening and the collapse of everything across Eastern Europe. It's all these things. But you can't just study 1989 for that to make sense. You've got to go back to 1945 to be perfectly blunt. So there isn't one year that I like studying. I think there's every year has a ton of really interesting things that happened, and they all relate backwards and they all relate forwards. I don't like maybe this is just the pedantic historian in me. I don't like the idea that we should only focus on a specific point in history. I think a specific area. I think it's really important to take what we call a holistic view, and let's sort of look at things in the broader context. This one specific event or one specific thing is happening, but it's related back to 16 other things that happened in 14 different places in the world, and some of them go back 200 years or whatever it happens to be. And that, to me, that's what I really, really love about history, is sort of taking a look at something and realizing that this isn't one little piece that's happening in isolation. Everything is interconnected. Things happen because of other things, and those things are happening because of other things. And there's the role of chance, and there's just all these different things, and that's what I really love about it. So I hate the idea of focus. I hate the idea of focusing on one specific point to the exclusion of everything else, because I don't think that's I don't think that's fair, right, or even that it makes sense. So hopefully that's not a half-assed answer. So yeah, that's South Korean Steven just called me a handsome man. Well, thank you very much. I did shave just for this. So did the USSR or other communist countries have LGBT life and liberation movements? Yes. And there's a big caveat to that because there's some really big differences depending, like, where in the world you're looking. Was homosexuality of any sort allowed or encouraged in the Soviet Union? Nope, it absolutely was not. But you go to East Germany and it was legal, and it wasn't something that a German citizen was going to be overtly prosecuted for. Does that mean that that LGBTQ communities were open and free and everyone was happy? Nope, absolutely not. Cultural prejudice still exists. Cultural prejudice is still a thing. It absolutely did apply. But from a legal perspective, it was legal in somewhere like East Germany. Other places, absolutely not. So I'd like to do more on that, especially the East German case, because to be honest, it is rather exceptional. But it is. I think it's a really interesting case study to highlight that there were really big differences, or could be really big differences between different communities, different countries within the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Bloc. Not every place was uniform. Just because Moscow did it one way doesn't mean that everyone had to do it the same way. So I think that's a really, really great instance to be able to highlight that. So let's see. Do I have a William Vanderstrand? Now I love it when this question comes up. Do I have a favorite movie about the Cold War era? I have a bunch of movies that I really love about the Cold War era. Hunt for Red October is an absolute classic. And it's 1990. It just sort of squeaks in at the very end of the Cold War as a movie. Obviously, it's based on a Tom Clancy book that was written in the 80s. Very much that height of Cold War stuff. I think that's just such a great movie. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, is a phenomenal dark comedy. It is, if you've never seen it, I think it's still on archive.org. You can watch it for free. Fantastic movie. I've always loved War Games with Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy. That is another great movie. It's about checkers. It's a great movie. But there's lots. I mean, the whole Bond movies are fun in their own way, and they use that as a Cold War sort of backdrop. There's a ton of really, really good movies out there. There's a German film called Goodbye Lenin, for anybody who hasn't seen that. That is a fantastic movie, and it's not necessarily that it's about the Cold War, but it's about life after the Cold War and about what's called nostalgia, which is basically the memory of the Cold War and the memory of being East German after reunification. Fantastic movie. On the flip side of that, The Lives of Others is about the Stasi and life in a police state, and it is so good and so well done and just such a gut punch. Threads, for anybody who wants a really, don't watch the movie because Threads is phenomenal. It's about a hypothetical what happens when England gets nuked. The only thing that I can say about Threads is absolutely watch it because it is a fantastic movie. Just probably don't plan on doing anything afterwards because it is depressing as hell. It is bleak is is really the best word. Is just absolutely bleak. 3 movies that sort of live in my psyche and rent free in no sort of good way, or come and see Threads and Grave of the Fireflies. So if you're looking for a triple bill to really completely and totally destroy any hope that you had for life, those would be the 3 movies. Those are my recommendations. And there's lots and lots of other movies. Keep in mind also when we talk about Cold War movies, Full Metal Jacket as well. But I mean, and the reason I'm going to bring up Full Metal Jacket is because is that a Cold War movie? Is that a Vietnam War movie? It's both. Movies that were made like up until 1990 that used like the Cold War wasn't a backdrop. No one was making Cold War movies. The Cold War was reality. It was always the backdrop to everything. And you get these like movies and TV shows and that, and like just media stuff that would make in the West, like in the States and in Canada, and you get this comment like it's like something about like talking about the Russians, and it's just this implied sort of understanding that the audience and the community that's watching and consuming the media, that they understand that the Russians is the stand for the Soviets, and those are the communists, and those are the bad guys. There's no explanation that needs to happen because that's just the backdrop. That's really interesting to me. That's this really interesting thing that we like people viewing have to keep that in mind to understand what the viewing audience would understand for the movie at the time that it was being made. That's let's see. Crispier majored in Eastern European Studies, 94 to 97. Visited the former GDR in 91 and Russia and Ukraine in 92 and 94. Yeah, that was a trippy time to be in the former East Bloc. I lived in Hungary from 1990 to 1994, and then I was living off and on in Moscow in the late 90s during the late Yeltsin period, and that was just wild to see transformations and really like how different people were able to cope or not cope. And it was just a really difficult time for a whole lot of people. Absolutely no doubt. But as viewing from the perspective of Western privilege, absolutely like a fascinating trip and a time to be there. So that's hang on to those memories. Write those down. To be honest, Crispy, like write that stuff down. If you haven't, write down, sit down and take a couple hours, couple of days, weeks, whatever. Write out your memories from that, because those are really important things for a lot of people, historians, to hang on to in terms of those experiences. I was sort of thinking about this the other day. This is a non sequitur, but the 90s was just a really weird time. It was a really weird time when you think about how different the 80s was against the 90s. Like the 80s was this sort of the peak and the pinnacle of the epitome of fear. There were times in the 80s where the threat of nuclear war was just sort of this constant, omnipresent thing that, combined with the instantaneosity, I'm making up language now, but with how fast it could happen, where you went from days to hours to minutes as the Cold War progresses in terms of how long it would take for a nuclear strike to arrive. The 80s had this like feeling of omnipresent fear, constant, in this cloud that everyone lived under with the end of détente from the 70s and then pushed certainly into the 80s. And then suddenly the wall comes down and the Soviet Union collapses and the 90s happen. And it's just this totally different atmosphere and mentality and of hope and freedom. And again, this is speaking certainly from Western privilege, where the economy's decent, and there's jobs, and there isn't the fear of like instant death, like all of those things. And that sort of lasts through the 90s until 9/11. But the 90s just has this really sort of weird feeling to it. And hopefully other people who were sort of around in the 90s can back me up on that. I've seen other people sort of like, echo the same sort of sentiments, but I don't know how you guys feel about that. But let's see. Visited Yekaterinburg in 1994. Yeah, with Sverdlovsk signs still up everywhere. That's absolutely the case. When I was living in sort of parallel to that, when I was living in Hungary and I was there until 1994, one of the major transit hubs on the Buda side of the city was called Moskvater. It was Moscow Square. That was the name of it in 1994. This is, almost 5 years after, the Russians had been, the Soviets, oh my God, like, I'm doing it myself. After the Russians had been told to, Minyahaza, to go home. And the main transit hub, and like, one of the main transit hubs in the city was still called Moskvater. It's been renamed to Kelmanter. I haven't been back to Budapest since 1995, so I don't know what it's actually been changed to. But it's this whole idea that even just vestigial signage lasts and it hangs around and it persists. It's those kind of effects. Like that's, like it's really interesting to see those changes and how some things changed, some things didn't. But yeah, that's Don Peterhoff making a comment. Common sentiment among Russian dissidents right now is we were so afraid of going back to the 1990s that we jumped all the way back to the 1910s. The 90s was really good in the West. The 90s was not really good for a lot of other people, and certainly in the former Soviet Empire. It was a really, really difficult, painful time, painful memories. And a lot of it is associated with the West forcing it on them. Someone was asking a question earlier about sort of how does Cold War history frame my understanding of, I'm going to put words in somebody's mouth and say Russian grievances now, but that's a really big aspect to it. People, like a lot of Russians, felt betrayed by the West, that there was this promise that everything, the communists would go and everything would be great and fantastic, and everyone would be like it would be Dallas for everybody, the TV show, by the way. And that's just not the reality of it. Like it was a really mass unemployment, or certainly like tremendous underemployment, grinding poverty, like just really, really tough. Without the idea that there was that there was going to be a pension and security that was at least promised like during the Soviet period. That's a really, when your expectation is undermined in such a tremendous way, that very much frames certainly where Putin comes from, in starting from 99 through the 2010s. So things to think about. And yeah. Dave's a killer, Dave's a mess. Well, I'm not a killer, but I am a mess. I will certainly agree with that. If that's from the movie Slapshot, I've never seen the movie Slapshot. I'm a terrible person. I understand. Yeah, that's I'm assuming that's what that's from, but yeah. That was an interesting question. What's my opinion about Che Guevara? Did he waste his life in vain? Che Guevara is an idealist, but a brutal one. He's, a mass killer. Like there's no denying that he was responsible for the deaths of thousands. But he was an idealist. Like he was doing it out of conviction. That doesn't make it any better, but he was doing that out of conviction. He's a really interesting guy. I actually just bought I found a really cheap copy of Motorcycle Diaries the other day. And I just now have to find time to read it, which is always much easier to find the books. It's a lot more difficult to find the time to actually read them. But Guevara is he's certainly an interesting guy. And I can understand why some people hate him, and I can empathize, I guess, why some people think that he's this great guy. Would I ever buy a T-shirt with his face on it? No, I'm not comfortable with that. I know too much about the guy. But yeah, that's congratulations to capitalism, by the way, for turning a mass killer into a T-shirt symbol. So there's impact on Henry Kissinger and his impacts on his decisions. Henry Kissinger is still alive. And Henry Kissinger is still alive. Henry Kissinger is not a nice person. His ideas of realpolitik resulted in the deaths of millions. And Kissinger made his decisions, and his thought process was based on what was going to be the best long-term interest for the nation, as opposed to thinking about the individuals. I don't, clearly from my language, you can tell. I've also referred to him as history's greatest monster. That's a Simpsons reference, by the way. But I'm not a big fan of Kissinger. I think I think there's a much finer line that can be walked in terms of making decisions that are in the interests, that are in the national interest, that can still take into account the idea that, that individual lives are at stake and at risk. So that is my opinion of Kissinger. What's my opinion on Thomas Sankara? Tobias, I don't know a great deal about Sankara. I think for those who don't know anything about Thomas Sankara was a military leader in Burkina Faso. He came to power on the back of and he came to power and made a lot of promises in terms of what he was going to do and how he was going to do it. And he wasn't in power very long before he was assassinated. And I can't help but feel that he came, like a lot of people, and a lot of leaders, like he came to power with the best of intentions. How he was going to do those things and actually fulfill those promises, that I don't know. And he never had the opportunity to be able to put those into practice. So the only thing that we have to hang on to is what he said he was going to do. There isn't a way for us to be able to judge him against what he was able to do. He's an interesting guy. Like, he's certainly an interesting guy in terms of like what his idealism was and what he wanted to do for Africa and for Africans. We'll get it. I'm going to do more on Sankara because I think he is a really interesting figure. But yeah, I think that it's really hard for me to pass judgment, or I shouldn't say pass judgment. That makes me sound whatever. It's hard for me to make an informed decision in terms of what, properly on Sankara, because he never had the opportunity to fulfill what he said he was going to do. So it looks like there's another question about Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah, was he a good leader or not? I think Kwame Nkrumah was, again, to fill in people who might not be as familiar with Nkrumah. Nkrumah was the first leader of what used to be the British colony of Gold Coast, that then became Ghana after its independence. Nkrumah was walking an interesting line in that he wanted to keep Ghana prosperous, but also independent. He didn't it's like after centuries of being dominated by the West, he wasn't interested in maintaining like deep relationships with the colonial master back to London. Certainly wanted to be more distinct and separate and walk a more independent line from them. Difficult when your economy is very much based and structured around that after 200 years. But he also didn't want to fall under Khrushchev's sort of umbrella, and thereby earn the ire of the United States. Like, that's a really interesting and difficult line to walk. Nkrumah is an interesting guy. And I would encourage people to go and find out more about him, and I want to do the same. But I know that that's very much the mentality and sort of the thought and the approach that Nkrumah sort of had to take, and what he had to keep in mind. So, yeah, that's hopefully that's a wishy-washy answer on Kwame Nkrumah. Here's a good question. Do I think that nuclear war is possible because of the war in Ukraine? Is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? No. I have not changed that answer. I've been asked that question multiple times, and it is a good question to keep asking. I've been asked that question multiple times since February 24th, 2022, and my response has not changed. I do not think that the likelihood of an actual nuclear exchange in Ukraine is particularly high. For a multitude of reasons, but it's the one card that Putin knows that he has, and it automatically generates ideas and fear and like all these, like, it's like, oh, like nuclear weapons. It's really the strongest card that he has, and he knows that if he plays it, he loses, because there is no way that there's no way that any kind of nuclear use isn't going to earn the response, like an automatic response in kind. There's a lot. Putin's been described as a lot of different things. He's not crazy. He's got a very, in my opinion, he's got a very different worldview than what a lot of people thought he might have had, or certainly that people in the West have. But he's not crazy. Nuclear exchange is crazy. So that's my opinion. Is it possible? Yes, because statistics work that way. Is it likely? No, I don't think so at all. Yeah. Let's see. What else do we have here? Who would win in a fist fight, Stalin or Churchill? That's the best question. That's a great question. I don't know. That's are we talking gloves, like bare knuckle? Is it Fight Club? Like, what's the? Give me some conditions here. My money's probably on Stalin because he's going to cheat, but I wouldn't put it past Churchill to do the same. So hey, you never know. Yeah. David Lawler asking about the status of. Oh, this isn't a loaded question. Asking about the status of Kosovo. We did an episode, sort of a little bit of a post-Cold War episode on Kosovo a couple of months ago, I think, at this point. David, go back and check that out. Hopefully that answers a lot of that. That is a really difficult question, no doubt. Let's see. Professional slap fight match. I'm assuming that's the whole Stalin versus Churchill. If it was a slap fight, I'm going to give that one to Churchill. The guy's a bruiser. I mean, Stalin used to rob banks, but anyways, that's, yeah. How close to war was the USSR and China during the border clashes in the 60s? Really, really close. We did an episode, I think it was late 2022, on the Damansky Island conflict. That's basically the 1969 border war. It was really, really close to a full-on war at that point. Nuclear weapons were sort of stepped up. There was no diplomatic back and forth between China and the Soviet Union. Things were very close. Cooler heads prevailed, fortunately. But yeah, that was no close thing. So let's see. Sorry for the silence. I'm just reading a couple of questions here, and I'm actually I'm gonna let you guys know I'm on a bit of a timeline here, so I'm not going to do this for too much longer. But get a couple more questions in here. So. Among the U.S. strategic approaches towards the USSR, and that's containment, NSC 68, New Look, Kennedy, Kissinger, which one was the most effective, in my opinion, and why? It depends on what you mean. Questions to think about in response to that is, what do you mean by effective? Like, how are you measuring effective? Is it containing the global spread of communism? Is it making sure that there's no a much lower risk of global war breaking out? There's a whole lot of different questions in terms of what you mean by that spawn from the idea of what do you mean by effective. This is my sort of approach in life and how I approach work and how I approach all these things. Engagement is really, really important. Keeping dialogue, ignoring things. Don't ask my wife about this, but ignoring things is probably the worst way that you can go about things, because as soon as you start ignoring it, then things, people start making up their own scenarios and guessing as to why something's happening, etc. Engagement and dialogue is almost, especially on the diplomatic stage, is almost always the absolute best way to proceed. It's a really interesting question. That's probably that would actually make for a really good roundtable debate with a couple of people that know what the hell they're talking about. But yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a particularly good answer for you right now. But that would be the one. That's my question that rises from that is, what do you mean by effective? One strategy might be super effective at stopping the spread of communism or capitalism, whichever side that you happen to be on. But it also might run a much higher risk of starting a thermonuclear war. Depends what your goal is. Yeah, let's see. Somebody wants to get a t-shirt with Pol Pot's face on it. That would make you just a terrible person. That's just an awful idea. Yeah, that's Pol Pot. Breaking news, Pol Pot, not a nice man. Genocide. That's genocide. I'm giving you a hard time. That's is there anything? That's a great. There's two more questions. This one and two more questions. Is there anything about the Cold War you've recently learned that has left a profound impact on me? I'm going to play fast and loose with the definition of recent. I think one of the biggest, before starting this project, one of the biggest preconceptions, or I don't want to say preconception, maybe one of the biggest traps that I could fall into is this idea of us versus them, which a lot of, I'm going to point the finger at politicians. A lot of politicians want you to buy into this whole idea of us versus them. And keep this in mind, everybody, for all aspects of your life, but there's us versus them mentality. At the end of the day, there shouldn't be an us versus them. What's for anybody who's traveled like extensively and spent time in some of the more different parts of the world from where you yourself grew up, in different cultures, there isn't a huge difference between myself and someone from India or someone from China or someone from Russia or someone from Nigeria or someone from Brazil. At the end of the day, it's about the senses of humor might be different. Germany, I'm looking at you. But at the end of the day, you love your family, you love your kids, you want to have a group of people around you, surround yourself with loved ones that are supportive that. There's common conditions and common things that everybody share. There might be a slightly different way that one culture might have about showing that or seeking that or whatever, but that's minor compared to that basic need. Yeah, that's my take on that. is that's been the biggest takeaway, is to always keep that in mind. That everyone who participated in the Cold War was just looking to live their lives. And some people got dragged into some really awful shit. So, yeah. That's, yeah. There we go. Here's an interesting question, and one that I don't get too often. What do I think about Gamal Abdel Nasser? Is he a popular failure? No. I think no. And Nasser's really interesting. Nasser, the big thing that Nasser sort of like is often, like lauded for was Egypt's role in the Suez crisis. And even with its, I'm not going to say its failure, like Egypt certainly took a beating in the 56 war. But at the end of the day, like, it's like the canal was nationalized. He stood up to the West. He stood up to the colonial powers. And in a lot of ways, that's really what people were looking for. Is he a failure? I don't think he was successful in everything that he did. The Pan-Arab project certainly didn't work the way that it was ever that he intended it to work. But was he popular? And he absolutely, and with a lot of people, with a lot of communities, he remained popular because he stood up to the colonial powers. He's a really interesting guy. I keep using this word like, oh, he's really interesting. Like all these people, all these figures that people are asking about, they're really interesting. They are really interesting. And they're like, everybody can be interesting. We talk about characters like Nasser, and someone would ask me about Olaf Palmason the last time that the last time I did a live stream. All of these things, they're all really interesting. These are figures that have risen to the top of their political societies, their cultural figures, whatever. That sets them apart from the unwashed masses, myself included. Like it's interesting, like that makes, and I'm not a subscriber to great man theory, but the idea like that we talk about certain people is because they've set themselves apart. Do I think Nasser is super interesting? Yeah, I do think he's really interesting in that he did something that millions of Egyptians had dreamed of doing, but he's the one that actually succeeded in doing it. So that sets him apart. A popular failure, I think that's a really interesting descriptor. I might steal that, actually. That's a failure in a lot of aspects, but certainly remained popular. One last question. And someone's asking me about, and I don't want to talk about liberation theology. That's a terrible way to end this. I don't want to talk about it. Please don't make me talk about it. You know what? I'm not going to look for a question right now. People occasionally ask me for book recommendations on Cold War topics. There's some really great work that's out there. There's some not as great work out there, like with anything. If you're looking for just a decent overview of the Cold War, Odar Nervestad's The Cold War, creatively named, is an excellent title. Right recently, I think it was 2017, I want to say. So it's relatively recent in terms of its scholarship. But it's an excellent, well put together overview of the Cold War. Brings in a lot of ideas, lots of things, like the interconnectedness of it all. Paul Thomas Chamberlain's Cold War Killing Fields is an excellent overview of the massive bloodletting, and like just basically it's again the Cold War Killing Fields by Paul Thomas Chamberlain, dispelling, and what he's doing in the book is he's dispelling the idea that the Cold War was cold. It's very much talking about how hot the Cold War actually was, just looking at Asia. And he starts in Korea, and he sort of works his way down around through Southeast Asia, through South Asia, and it ends up in the Gulf region. And sort of just Indonesia is in there as well. And outlining like just the millions and the situation surrounding the deaths of millions and millions of people as a result of the Cold War. Really very, very interesting. Excellent book, well written, well presented. All these really key things. Academic writing can be dull, to say the least. Interesting content, but the writing is often very jargony and it's written a specific way for a specific reason. Academic writing that's easily accessible is a rare thing. That's a really good book that managed to spell that. Lawrence Luthie's The Cold War is also, Cold Wars, sorry. Lawrence Luthie's Cold Wars is excellent in terms of demonstrating, again, like this the interconnectedness of different events and ideas and threads through the Cold War that continually keep running. That's a really, really good book. I don't have it necessarily close. I've got a new bookshelf that I put up, and I don't know where anything is on it because I haven't had a chance to really organize it yet. Yeah, those would be, if you're looking for sort of like an overall Cold War holistic view, like more higher holistic views. Yeah. And then we start getting into areas specific studies and topics, which, I mean, depending on what you're looking for, no matter what you're looking for, there's excellent work out there. I'm sure that if anybody is looking for specific recommendations, send us an email, the Cold War Channel at gmail.com. Send us a Cold War Channel. Send us a Cold War Channel. Send us an email at the Cold War Channel at gmail.com. And I can either make a recommendation based on work that I'm familiar with, or I can certainly do a little bit of digging and sort of find something that I think might be suitable for what it is that you're looking for. Always happy to help. Yeah, on that note, thank you for the 100 or so people that have jumped in here. Really appreciate you guys taking a bit of time out of your day to join. I apologize I didn't give any sort of advance notice on this. Hoping to do another one of these, maybe an evening my time, so middle of the night in Europe, but more accessible hopefully in North America for people who who might work more 9 to 5, and then certainly Asia Pacific. But thank you again. Make sure to like, subscribe, send us an email if you have questions. Check out the episodes every Saturday. We have a new one coming out Saturday morning, 9 a.m. Eastern time, as always. It's a pretty good episode. I always say that because I always think that we do good work. But yeah, that's all for now. So press like, press subscribe, send us money, Patreon, like all those good things that keep us that keep the lights on. Let me have internet to talk to you guys. And we'll talk to you guys later. Thanks so much.